Everyone, if you all could find your seat, I'm informed we have a quorum and it is awfully early in early December at 21 degrees. So others are probably trying to get their bodies moving in the cold. So we're going to start anyway. So let me say what we're doing today. Representative Schonkweiler has a fairly major bill coming for next year, and it's not through OCR yet. There are a few things still being negotiated because some of the stakeholders are not as excited about getting done as I am. So we're going to have her tell us a little bit about at least some bullet points about what's in the bill. And then we're going to have a presentation that was delivered at a task force from the off OED. And then we'll have because the bill is bigger than performance-based rate making. It's actually got some other things in it that we think are important. We're not going to take any public testimony. We're not going to take any votes, but rather than next year is going to be very, very short and very, very quick. The way I see it, we'll have time for maybe 2 hearings here. Senator Cook will probably only have time for 1 because he shares the gavel with the Commerce chair. So we thought, well, this information, we would just wind up taking hearing time in early January, which is pretty valuable. So we decided we would do it this morning. We'll allow Representative Pierce committee questions and comments, but we're going to be fairly guarded about what all's in the bill because we don't want to commit things in detail that are still being negotiated. But we're open to input because there's some things that, believe it or not, brother, I think there's some things in here you're going to like. Please like them. So yeah, it's an early Christmas. I'm trying to bring some joy into the week, guys. So with that, if we could do some introductions, let me start down with Representative Wesco, who is one of my most enthused about being here early in the morning because he's young and up early. And
well, Mr. Chairman, this is Representative Tim Wesco from Osceola, Indiana. 150 miles away, by the way. 5 a.m. came early.
1:55.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Dale Devon, St. Joe County, home of the Fighting Irish.
Elena Schonkweiler, Noblesville, District 29.
Kendall Culp, House District 16, parts of Jasper, Pulaski, Stark, and White counties.
Dave Hall, House District 62. That's all of Brown County and part of Jackson and Monroe County.
Ed Soliday, District 4, Southern Porter County.
Jim Pressel, District 20, LaPorte County, and part of Stark County, 162 miles away in a different time zone.
Matt Pierce, State Representative District 61, which is most of the city of Bloomington and includes my constituents who are on the undefeated IU football team.
Alex Burton, House District 77, Evansville, which is in a different time zone as well, and the closest one on here to Kentucky.
Sarah Berkman, Legislative Services.
With that, thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming early in the morning, but I think you'll find the information that's going to be shared pretty valuable, and it does open the door to let you do some research on the topics we're planning to cover. So with that, Representative Schonkweiler, if you'd like to just give us a high-level overview of what you're planning to do.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So Indiana's regulatory structure has served us well for generations, and it's provided stability, supported investment, and delivered dependable service across our state. 2 years ago, in House Enrolled Act 1007, the legislature formally asked the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission to study performance-based rate making and deliver recommendations. And the IURC fulfilled that request this fall. Their report was thorough, balanced, and data-driven. Gave us a menu of responsible pathways that Indiana could pursue. Several of you were in that summer study committee. We studied those findings, and their central conclusion was clear. Indiana should not jump headfirst into a full PBR overhaul, but Indiana should begin taking structured incremental steps toward integrating performance-based rate making into our regulatory toolbox. And today's proposal does exactly that. In many ways, what we are doing is simple. We're updating our regulatory tools so utilities are held accountable for delivering the outcomes we want: strong reliability, improved resilience, and better affordability. This is the essence of performance-based rate making, or PBR. And while PBR is not new nationally, this year marks Indiana's first significant step. Nationally, Indiana is not alone taking this step. Over the past decade, 17 states plus Washington, D.C. have enacted legislation authorizing or requiring PBR. Other states like New York have implemented PBR administratively without legislative direction. The reason is simple. The energy landscape is evolving rapidly. Aging infrastructure, extreme weather, customer expectations, and economic pressures are pushing states to modernize regulatory tools that have not significantly changed in more than a century. Today, Indiana is entering that national conversation carefully, thoughtfully, and in that, there's several items that we can discuss from a conceptual overview. As the chairman mentioned, no commitments are being made today. Many things are being considered. Number one, in the Christensen report, which we'll be hearing more shortly, highlighted several advantages of performance-based rate making, but specifically multi-year rate planning. In that, there are three key concepts: stability. Both utilities and customers gain predictability when revenue requirements and rates are set over multiple years. Cost efficiency. With longer periods between rate cases, utilities have stronger incentives to operate efficiently and manage costs, and incentives include disincentives as well, so carrots and sticks. Reduced regulatory burden. The fewer full rate cases mean reduced administrative overhead, and that ultimately saves time and money for ratepayers. These aren't abstract benefits, they're practical tools that many other states currently use. At its core, PBR, performance-based rate making, is all about alignment. Right now, our regulatory system largely incentivizes capital investment, new infrastructure, new projects, regardless of how those investments perform for customers. PBR allows us to shift some of that incentive towards outcomes. Are the lights staying on? Are outages being restored promptly? Are long-term planning decisions sound? And are we maintaining affordability and while keeping the utilities accountable? In short, PBR is like a performance review, something nearly every employer uses for its employees. It creates expectations, measures real-world results, and aligns compensation with performance. We expect accountability and transparency from every sector of government and business. It's reasonable to expect the same of our utilities. PBR is a complementary tool. At a high level, that means if we defining the outcomes we want, measuring utility performance against those outcomes, and aligning utility earnings with success in achieving them. One of the primary tools in a PBR is called performance incentive mechanisms, or PIMs, a structure that ties financial incentives to specific performance targets. Again, I'm going to reiterate that this stays at the conceptual level. We are not committing to any specific PIMs, formulas, or structures, but we are taking several things into consideration. Under a performance incentive mechanism linking to outcomes, we are looking at three targeted areas. Resource adequacy. So this year we are focusing on these three specific areas, while performance incentives can be meaningful, practical, and immediately beneficial to Hoosiers. Resource adequacy. Our utilities must plan for sufficient capacity and resources to keep the lights on at the lowest reasonable cost. That means clear expectations for long-term planning, transparent modeling, and accountability for decisions that affect reliability and affordability decades into the future. Customer-focused reliability. We all know Indiana's infrastructure, from poles and wires to transformers, is aging. Storms, vegetation, systems fatigue are real challenges. Customers understand bad weather happens, but they also understand that when they pay their utility bill every month, they expect safe, reliable service in return. This framework ensures utilities are investing appropriately in the grid and meeting measurable reliability targets using nationally recognized reporting standards. Finally, affordability. Affordability requires both short-term and long-term solutions. Long-term PBR can help reduce costs by improving planning, reducing regulatory lag, and focusing utilities on cost-effective outcomes. But families need support now. An affordability provision that will be a second part to this bill. Affordability has immediate and long-term dimensions. In the long term, PBRs and multi-year rate plans can encourage efficiency and planning decisions that benefit customers, but this year's bill also includes short-term affordability measures, such as mitigating seasonal bill shocks that create hardships for family with fixed or tight budgets, preventing disconnections or reevaluating the disconnection criteria, and strengthening utility assistance programs, creating more predictable monthly payments for low-income households. Taken together, these are meaningful protections for the Hoosiers that need them most. And again, this is not a full-scale PBR. This is an incremental step toward aligning performance. I can look at, let's see. In this approach, we're being methodical, we're being incremental, and grounded in Indiana's energy pillar policy pillars. We'll take this step, one that positions us to learn, evaluate, and adjust without taking on unnecessary risk. The goal is simple: to provide immediate protection for customers today while building responsible pathway forward in the long term with performance-driven improvements for tomorrow. Would you like any?
I would just ask, because some details are still
Fluid.
Basically, we're trying to get some, there's a lot of rhetoric out there. We're trying to work through it and be data-driven, but the people who have the most difficulty with their electric bills are the poor. So we have some very specific things which we're pretty certain of where we're going. We're pretty certain where we're going with some things for the folks who are the poorest. And we can have some discussion, but one of the things I feel strongly about is, which didn't help the rhetoric, is one utility, their rates went up. The rate didn't go up at all, but their utilization July over June went up 85%. And it's a rate-based system. So if you use 85% more electricity, your bill is going to be 85% more. For some of us, we go, we're used to that. For others, that is a bill shock. And so we're going to try to do something that takes that shock out. But Representative Pierce, you had talked to me, and I've talked to Ms. Schonkweiler. We want to be really sure that we're very transparent about true up. So no one's shocked with the true up. I was, believe it or not, I was actually listening, Matt. So carefully, I think you're right. Write that down. Soliday said, Representative Pierce is right. So we're trying to do some things. We're trying to make them as simple as possible so that we're not, energy regulation can be hugely complex and very, very hard to explain to somebody who isn't living it every day of their lives. So we're trying to get something. That's why we're not dropping a bill right away. There was some encouragement to do that, but we're trying to kind of creep up on it and make sure everybody understands what we're doing. So if you have some general questions, feel free to ask them, or suggestions of things you might want to see in the bill. We're open to that for a couple of minutes. And so, yes, Representative Pierce.
Yeah, I won't push you to get very specific because I know you're still working on things, but I just wanted to make sure on the affordability piece, the kind of general areas you're looking at is mitigating seasonal bill shocks. I got that right. And then did you say preventing disconnections or what?
Look, reviewing the criteria for disconnects. So I know as we've talked to the utilities, this obviously is for investor-owned electric utilities. If a customer is already disconnected, they have the ability with smart meters to be able to turn on that meter again in a high heat advisory day or a very cold day. So reviewing those, there's already stipulation of those cold months where it prevents them from being disconnected during those cold months. But we're looking at how do we look at those hot heat advisory days without extending it, for months and months and months, So we are looking at it from that perspective.
Okay.
Matt, we don't want to, the summer is important because senior citizens have great tolerance for extreme heat, but we also don't want to make it such a long period that then when the recovery winds up a burden and rams them into the winter months. So trying to find something that is workable, and we're trying to find, I promise you, like all legislation, it will not be perfect, but that's what we're trying to do.
And I don't think I maybe caught the third thing. I wrote down more predictive bills, and I was kind of wondering how that's different than the seasonal bill shock. So
Well,
is there a better way for me to understand that
so-
third prong?
We're looking at some conversations around, I would say, budget billing and what that looks like for different citizens. So, I know, for instance, my parents are on budget billing. They're retired. They're on a fixed income. It makes sense for them. It doesn't make sense for everyone. So having an opt-out opportunity there, but allowing for that to provide some stability for both the utility and the ratepayer. We're looking at those options, as a few others.
Okay, so I guess I'm trying to understand if there's a difference between mitigate several bill shocks, which was the first thing you mentioned,
Yeah.
and more predictable bills. Is that really just one thing, or are there two different policies kind of on those two different areas?
I would say there's several different considerations that would, and when we look at what is affecting potentially low income households, bill shock is one of those. So if they all of a sudden, from a usage perspective or from a budget billing, if they're budgeted and now all of a sudden owe more, that initial hit, some families can't afford to do that true up. And so we're looking at how that true up and the transparency of that occurs. And obviously, this is still information, so we would take any suggestions that you would want us to consider.
Let me lift the veil a little bit.
I'm trying.
And again, the details aren't finished yet. Multi-year allows them to, that doesn't mean you go 3 years without any kind of accountability. If you look at North Carolina, some of the other states, one of the folks that don't like PBR are saying, well, this is all Democrat states. That's not true. This is not a R versus D. It's an accountability system, and it rewards good performance. So one of the things is with multi-year rate making is that now you have a pretty good idea what it's going to look like for 3 years.
Mhm.
Things like fuel that bounce all over, you can't predict. So that's one thing. The other thing is that there's going to be significant positive and negative consequences for rate increases above or below certain levels. So rather than some of the more radical proposals that have come out of this building lately, because we're in the middle of transition, transformers cost 50% more than they did 2 years ago. You've got to either cut back on the number of poles and transformers you're replacing, or you've got to be able to adjust for huge inflation. So we went through a short period of 8%. That's pretty significant. And then when the supply chain gets cranked like it is right now, you've got to be able to adjust for that when you've got an aging infrastructure system. But we're working on a system so that it's transparent and there's significant consequences for higher or lower rate increases. So I'd rather not go further because we'll have plenty of time to yell at each other. Does that help a little?
Mr. Chairman.
Yes. Representative Wesco, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a general question. A performance-based rate making, how is that different than our current system, and how would you describe our current rate making system?
Do you want to do it or you want me to do it?
I can let you take that one. But I know a lot of the cost services, but I'll let the chairman take that.
Well, basically ours today is cost-based. system, and we're going to have somebody from the IURC speak here shortly. But PBR has measurable consequences in a cost base. You have a year-long rate case periodically. Back when things were really stable, it could be 20 years between rate cases, or it could be 2 years between rate cases. This establishes a more consistent system and has very defined rewards, incentives, and negative incentives. That's the short version, but you're gonna hear a presentation on PBR here shortly.
All right, I'll just wait to hear more. Thank you.
Yes. Good.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So as I travel around the state and talk to a lot of folks in agriculture, they're the big user of electricity are irrigation systems. And in parts of the state, it's more than others from demand charges. And so as I'm learning about demand charges, is they will take your high, week, month, whatever, and that becomes your demand charge for the year. With that example, you use those maybe 2 months out of the year. Another example was a county fair. A county fair during the week of the fair uses more electricity than the other 51 weeks of the year, but that becomes their bill for the year. And so I assumed, well, at the end of the year, they had a credit. They said, no, that money is all spent. They don't get any money back. Are you addressing those types of charges within the PBR?
Well, here's where the discussion is right now. The folks who have been most vocal are residential. There's 3 rates. There's industrial, commercial, and residential. So there is some discussion about whether that you get your money back. No, they had to generate the electricity, period. So they had to buy the gas. That's a fact. So whether we would take that and put it in a budget-based system and spread it out over the year or not for industrials or commercial, that's something we're still talking about. The way we're talking right now with an opt-out system, you can take it if you don't want it. Right now there is a system like that, but you have to opt in. We would make it a mandatory and opt out, but they're not going to give you money back for electricity and coal you burned and gas you burned. They'll spread it. We can consider spreading it over time, but giving you your money back probably not going to happen. Okay. Because you know who's going to pay for that if we give the farmer his money back? His grandma down the street.
Well, I may have not represented that correctly. The way I understand it is they assume that is your monthly usage for 12 months. When my example is your monthly usage for 2 months, but yet you pay that amount all 12 months, even though they're not using the power.
We'll look at it because that doesn't seem logical. Right. Yeah. Well, Luke will address it. That's why he's my grandson. So any other questions? Yes.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Rep. Schockweiler, for bringing this forward and presenting this to us. I know we're talking about transparency and really the shock, reducing the shock. Earlier this year, there was a great shock in the Evansville area. And as a result, more than 16,000 residents are past due on their bill. And that average amount of those 16,000 behind is about $312.50 going into the new year. And so I'm grateful. I'm excited to hear more about this pathway and looking at the performance-based rate making. New York State and Washington State have some good examples of making sure that metrics are based, that there's a way to track the cost in census tracts, just because that is very, as a part of the low income dynamic that comes as it relates to utility costs. And so that's one example of an idea, a suggestion that I'd love to talk with you with. And then metrics that capture the annual bill cost or the average bill cost on an annual basis, making that public, because it's one thing to say a rates increased 20 or 30%, but it's one thing to see it actually in dollars and cents. For instance, I can say that my bill in August was $232, but then in September, my bill was $350.13. that those numbers, I think, really matter as we look to really capture the essence of affordability. And then as you were talking about weatherization, one of the things that a lot of people back home are really getting hung up on is all the steps that people have to take and the information that they have to take from one place to the other, get from their landlord if their landlord is willing. So I'd love to have the conversation about what that could look like, making sure that it's more accessible, even if that means working through the townships and making sure that families can be supported. And then the last thing I wanted to say is just that, I know North Carolina is the guiding light for a lot of what we're looking at, but Washington and New York are both two examples that are doing some forward-thinking things, but are actually capturing the affordability aspect that many households are experiencing and really are feeling crushed, especially at this time going into the holiday season.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just because this is a pet peeve of mine. My electric bill runs about $200 a month, my average. In June, my bill was $200. In July, it was $400. There was not a rate increase. It was an extremely hot month, and suddenly people were screaming it was a rate increase. No one. Look at volume and actual price. And because if you look at our cheapest months are usually the spring and fall, and usually even it's reasonable in November. I don't know what's going on right now, but at any rate, when folks talk about rate increases, they need to look at the rate and then how much electricity did I use. So that's one of the things we're trying. The fact that mine went up, fortunately, the good Lord was good to me in my previous life. The fact that mine went up almost 100%, okay, it did, but I didn't have to skip food. So that's part of the idea of doing budget-based rate making. So you know what's coming, and then we're actually talking about truing up twice a year instead of once, so we don't wind up with other shock in the true up. So, and we're willing to talk about, Representative Pierce and I have talked about it briefly and so forth. So, yeah, I just was sort of approached, shall I say, at the Columbia Club last night, and the person said, look at this industrial bill, look how much it was. And I said, that was August. What was the rate? The rate didn't change. Yes, the IURC agreed to a rate increase, but it hadn't kicked in yet. What was their utilization? Oh, so again, helping consumers understand that when their bill comes, look at your usage and so forth. And for industrials and commercials, most of the utilities, and I'm not taking their side, we're going to press them for more of this, will help you with an energy audit. Here's where you're spending a lot of money on energy that you don't need to. And so that increases overall demand and so forth. So the more disciplined we all are, the better off we are. But comparing apples, there's been so much rhetoric over the summer trying to get down to what is the real data and what does the data show. So we're going to hear from Mr. Wilson real shortly in a peer-reviewed study. This was not a review of Facebook opinions. This was actually PhD types reviewing the study and commenting on it. So one of the things I've been fascinated to learn over the summer that data centers cause diabetes, and I'm looking for the peer-reviewed study on how that happens. So with that, anything further? Thank you, Representative
Thank you.
Schonkweiler. Why don't we do this? Why don't we do Mr. Wilson first? And if you want to step out of character and answer the question on agricultural electric.
Yeah, and that's Luke Wilson, a Chief Policy Officer now of the Indiana Office of Energy Development. I think I put the wrong one up there. But the demand charge question, I get to that a little bit later in the presentation. But essentially, think about it I always think about it as sort of in terms of a water system. So the water you use is the energy that you're paying for the actual kilowatts you use, but you need a pipe to your system. And how big of a pipe do you need for your maximum water usage at a time? So a demand charge is essentially trying to account for, I have to build a line that's this big to your commercial or industrial system. I have to have a generation plant ready to go to serve that maximum peak load that you have at any given time. I need to account for those costs somehow. And utilities will usually do that in some sense through peak demand charge and trying to figure out what do you contribute to the overall system peak and try to recover some costs that way while still charging you some for energy and some for your peak demand, because ultimately I may use less water during the winter because I'm not using my sprinkler system, but the water utility had to install lines to account for the whole neighborhood sprinkler systems going off at the same time. So that's what demand charge is trying to get to, is saying, what do I contribute to those peak system demands? Because we have to meet or build the system to meet that peak demand. So with that, as Representative Westrow pointed out, and I'm sure Representative Pierce can empathize with, I appreciate you all being here at 9 a.m. for the class on rate making and regulatory impacts on utility prices. I'll try to keep it interesting and as brief as I can. And to do that, I'm going to be setting the stage a little bit, give you a little bit of foundational elements of the regulatory structure we currently have, go into the rate making basics, talk about regulation impacts, then also talk about House Enrolled Act 1007, which I know you guys are probably sick and tired of hearing about already, but talk about some of the benefits or the ideas behind that public policy, and then let's get started. So again, utilities have exclusive monopoly territories because they're considered natural monopolies in the state, but they, as part of this, they have an obligation to serve all customers and provide safe and reliable service to those customers. Ultimately, the IURC authorizes those rates and charges that a utility may charge its customers. The IURC is required to be an impartial fact-finding body, and it approves the building of new generation resources, ensures cost recovery for those investments in generation, transmission, and distribution facilities that are found prudent. So what's a natural monopoly? Well, what you want to do is avoid this. You don't want your right-of-ways looking like this with utility poles everywhere, wires strung up everywhere. That's duplication of services. If you minimize that, only have one set of infrastructure to serve customers. If you have good regulation, a good government regulation of that monopoly, you can minimize the overall cost of the system. Indiana, as you guys are all well aware, has seen a significant change in its generation mix over time, going from a heavy coal state to a state that I'll say is an all of the above approach of natural gas, wind, and solar, all growing over the past 20 years in Indiana. Three main factors have driven this transition: energy market economics. Renewable energy resources don't have a fuel cost associated with them, so they compete very well on that. Federal and state policies. So you have your investment tax credits, your production tax credits. States may have a portfolio standard for what percentage of generation they want from certain resources. And then you have aging generation plants, so your natural build cycle. At some point, it becomes more economical to give up a power plant, to give up the old truck because you're spending too much on tires, on new transmission, new engine, etc. You're just like, I want something new. So there's a natural build cycle associated with the transition as well. Utilities go through this cycle by doing their integrated resource plans, which again are their long-term forecasts. How do I deliver the lowest cost possible while maintaining flexibility and optionality? Congress is changing and the presidency is seemingly changing every election cycle. Public policy is changing every election cycle. How do I make long-term investment decisions while maintaining optionality to minimize cost to my customers? As part of that, you also have to serve customers 24/7, 365. Resource adequacy matters. The installed capacity of any system at any given time is not production at a time of system need. So on the left, you see MISO's accreditation for different generation resources. On the right is PJM. MISO currently has a seasonal accreditation, so I'll point out a couple. You'll see combined cycle natural gas in the 90s during summer, fall, and then it falls down into winter at 77, spring 79. That means if you have a 1,000 gigawatt summer plant during the summertime, it is 95%. So 950 megawatts to meet your system need. During the wintertime, it's 770 megawatts. You keep going down, you see solar goes from 38% in the summer to 24% in the winter. Wind goes from 8% in the summer to 22% in the winter. So you have to constantly adjust these puzzle pieces to make sure you have the right resource mix to meet demand at any given time. And that's important because I like this statistic from MISO on their wind generation from last year. So in the bottom left, you see total installed capacity in MISO for wind generation was 31 gigawatts or 31,000 megawatts. But during 2 periods of time in July of last year, that 31 gigawatts of energy generation essentially produced zero power to the grid. Zero power, 31 gigawatts is zero power to the grid. So you have to account for that in your system when you're trying to design a system. So accredited capacity matters. You need an all of the above approach right now to the figure out energy storage and duration. Combine that with the fact that you have load growth returning and you have a jam queue to build new generation resources. So now we're sort of entering what you've seen in the media with this crunch. You're trying to get new generation resources built to meet this growing demand, but you can't get systems built for one reason or another. Maybe they're stuck in the study with the RTO. Maybe they can't get local siting or permitting. Maybe there's some issue with the state or federal government. You're trying to build things, but you just can't do it right now. And that's becoming an issue nationwide. And so with that, let's get to the boring part of the presentation and talk about rate making 101 and some of the basics to explain more cost allocation and get to the question of how cost of service and PBR may be a little bit different. So remember, IURC authorizes rates and charges for utilities. This is part of the regulatory compact. Government gives you a monopoly. Government sets your rates and charges where you can recover from your customers. And you do this generally through a cost of service rate making to help determine what's just and reasonable for a utility to recover from their customers. A key facet of this is determining what the total revenue requirement is for that system. What does the utility need to recover its costs while providing safe and reliable service to its customers while having that reasonable opportunity to earn a fair rate of return on their investments? Another way of putting that is that when utilities make investments, you need to return that capital to them. That's the return of the capital. And you need them to give them the opportunity to earn a recovery or a return on the investments that they made, because you want them to give their money into the utility system versus putting it on the stock market. So you need to compensate them for the money they invest into the system. So what does that look like as an equation? Well, you have your operating expenses on the left, your rate base times your rate of return, and your total ultimately equaling your total revenue requirement. So let's break that down component by component here. So operating expenses, your wages and benefits, your power purchases, your fuel cost, insurance, legal, financial expenses, maintenance. All of those are operating expenses, and you don't earn a return on those. You just get those passed through. They're costs that are passed through to ratepayers. Rate base that's what the investments are into your system to make your system actually work. So it's to serve your customers, you minus your accumulated depreciation. That includes your power plants, your transformers, utility poles, your vehicles, etc. So think about that as your actual steel in the ground as your rate base. And you multiply that rate base by the interest cost on the debt used to pay that to invest in that system, and then the capital invested into that system from investors and shareholders is the rate of return. So the cost of financing your system in general. And what does that look like? Well, here's a hypothetical rate of return calculation. So common equity, preferred equity, that's your shareholder money. And so you take your capital structure and then that cost of capital elements, your rate of return, your authorized rate of return for that. Your long-term debt, short-term debt, ultimately, you add up your capital structure to 100, you assign an individual capital cost to each of those buckets, and then you end up with your weighted cost of capital. So oftentimes when you hear what a utility's authorized return on equity is, that's that middle column top piece. So that's what your shareholder equity is. But ultimately, what a utility is sort of in its old system earning is that weighted cost of capital, that bottom right number, because you have to factor in debt and shareholder equity. So what does that look like in the Indiana utility? Well, here's one example from a recent rate case showing the sort of total, the electric utilities company capitalization, its equity, debt, customer deposits, deferred income taxes. It's a little bit more complicated, but you're just seeing here that ROE, the utilities ROE is at 9.75%. Then you see lower cost of capital for different debt structures, et cetera. Another example here in terms of what a utility's sort of cost of capital structure looks like as well. Again, that ROE for the common equity or shareholder money is at 9.8%, and that weighted average cost of capital is that bottom right number at 6.77%. And so I want to take this and look at it another way. So I went through, the total revenue requirement, but another way to look at these buckets is the operating cost. So what's it take to operate the system? The depreciation cost. So again, that return of capital. I invested money into the system. I need to get that money back from the system. Your financing cost, the return on capital. I need to pay you for your money that you've invested into the system. And then taxes. All of those round up and enter into your revenue requirement that you need to run the system. But once you have that revenue requirement, how do you figure out what to charge customers to get that revenue requirement back to utility? Well, we use cost causation principles to determine that. And so ultimately, you sign that revenue requirement into different buckets. So you have your generation costs, your transmission costs, your distribution costs, and other costs associated with the system. And so what does that look like at a US-wide level? Well, generation costs usually make up about 60% of the cost of the average price of electricity, distribution at 26, transmission at just below 14% of that cost. And so then you take those costs and you break them down on what I was describing earlier, your energy costs, your demand costs, and then your per customer costs. So again, energy is how much kilowatts am I using over a total month? Demand is saying what's my peak level of demand at any given moment throughout a certain time period. Because ultimately, if I'm using a whole lot of energy at one given point in time, the utility needs to build a bid transmission line or a bid substation to help serve me. A neighborhood that has a lot of EVs in the neighborhood may need a new transformer to serve it and a new demand charge for the amount of power we're drawing at any given time. And then you have your per customer charge. It takes a lot more to serve 200 customers in a neighborhood than one commercial customer or one strip mall, right? So there's per customer charges that differ based on how many customers you have and how those costs are assigned. And so then you've broken down those costs and then you start assigning them to your individual customer classes, your residential customer class, your commercial customer class, your large power or industrial customer class, and your street line class. And you try to decide how much energy you're using, what's your peak demand at any given time, and how do I assign that to class to ultimately determine that rate structure to make sure I recover that total revenue requirement. So you take a step back and you can sort of see the big picture here. You have on the left the actual cost for the operating the utility. It feeds into your revenue requirement. You break out those costs into different cost buckets. How are those cost buckets incurred versus energy demand and customer charges? And then how does each customer class ultimately contribute to those charges? And how can I best recover that through those customers in order to make sure that the customer that is causing a cost is ultimately paying for those costs? And so using old data from 2022 presentation the IURC gave to the 21st Century Task Force, you can see how those average customer class cost breakdowns work between residential and industrial, and commercial is right in the middle. So for residential customers, generation is about 50% of the cost. Your general costs, which are like more administrative costs of actually running the utility, 18%, distribution, 23%, transmission, 9%. Industrial is way different. And generation 71%, transmission's higher at 13%, but distribution's way lower at 8%, general's at 8%, which sort of makes sense, right? Because ultimately, if I have a large car manufacturer, they're going to be using a whole lot of energy generation. They're going to need bidder plants. They're going to need a bidder transmission line to their system to account for the amount of demand they're using at their peak demand, which is different from a residential customer class, because I have to, for a neighborhood, I have to put up how many more poles, how many more wires, how many more transformers to serve that. That all breaks down into different buckets for these utilities. And so we've talked about cost of service. Let's talk about regulation and the impacts on rates. And so why go over all that? Well, I wanted two reasons to really emphasize today. Number one, cost flow in the rates. You take your cost, you determine how those costs are allocated, and that's how you need rates to recover those costs to the utilities. And policy decisions ultimately impact costs. So policy flows in the cost, flows in the rates. As to steal a quote from someone else, we live not in a command and control economy, but in an incent and achieve economy. You set the policy, others go out to achieve the policy goals that you want, and ultimately that flows into the rates. So policy, cost, and the rates. And part of that is because we've gone over the science aspect of rate making. How do you determine what the actual costs are? How do you allocate those costs? making sure that something's used and reasonable. But the art section or the art part of rate making is the policy impacts. What do you want to your utilities to achieve? What are the rules and regulations you want to set for the utilities? How do you exactly, maybe you want subsidization between customer classes. That's all part of the rate making structure. There's a science element and an art element, and that art element is the policy side of things. And so to highlight policy choices that have impacted Indiana ratepayers are environmental regulations. So there's a whole host of examples of environmental regulations there that have impacted generation plants in Indiana over the past 25 plus years. And I want you to remember, going back to the start, where was Indiana generation mix in 2007? Well, we were heavily invested in coal-fired generation, and investments need to be made to continue operating those plants under these new environmental rules. So remember, policy flows in the cost, flows in the rates. When you make investments into a system, you're increasing the cost of the system. Those costs of the system have to be recovered through rates. And so another facet to keep in mind is what's happening with Indiana's load growth over the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. It's growing. So what happens when load growth levels off or decreases? You're making investments into the system and you need to recover those investments through rates. Well, you're recovering higher cost over fewer kilowatt hours. So here's the demand, peak demand from SUFG's 2023 report. The new report's coming out within the next couple of weeks, showing Indiana's peak demand about in 2010, 2011, going down. And you see here's investments in Indiana's steam plants, and you see circled two areas where there's been high levels of net plant, or you're adding to the rate base, or the rate base of the system. So remember, rate base is the capital investments into the system. And when that goes up, you need to recover that. And so what happens? Well, Indiana, as you all well know and have heard before, was very competitive in the 90s and early 2000s because of our generation mix. Very few environmental regulations. We were living off the generation we had built, had low variable costs associated with that, and so it was great. But what happens as we're making those investments in 2005 to 2008, 2014, 2015, we start to see that rate ranking compared to other states go up. It's creeping up. That continues over the 2010s as well. Those rate rankings continue creeping up, and then they start leveling out in 2019 to 20, et cetera, as we've made those investments already, and you're starting to depreciate those away. Shown another way, you can see again sort of low rate rankings in the 90s to early 2000s as those environmental costs are investments are made into the system. Rate rankings go up, and they start leveling off again. SUFG in the study actually highlights this and say, due to the state's heavy reliance on coal as a fuel source for electricity generation, Indiana is expected to experience larger price increases than those projected on a regional or national level because of those federal environmental regulations levied on coal-fired generation. So again, what's the policy? Federal environmental regulations. What the costs are associated with making those environmental compliance investments to let those plants continue running. Those flow in the rates, and you saw Indiana's rate competitiveness erode a little bit because of that.
Just while you have that one up there, the other thing that happened in that 2012 arena, when I came in the legislature, natural gas sold for about $12 a therm. Once fracking came in, that I've seen it as low as $1.89. So coal's competitiveness was not only affected by environmental regulation, it was affected by the marketplace because natural gas became much cheaper. And so those states that were heavily weighted with natural gas already, we started to fall behind them because we had. So I don't want to lay it all off on environmental reg. There was also a major change in fuel prices.
Oh, you're absolutely right. And I'm just highlighting just an example of how policy decisions impact rates, but you're exactly right, because states that were more heavily invested in natural gas ultimately enjoyed the benefits of lower natural gas costs. So again, because ultimately lower costs equal lower rates. And so how does this look like in terms of just an example depreciation structure? You make $1 billion investment to a plant, you're slowly returning that capital to investors, giving the rate of return, and then you make upgrades, and you have to depreciate those upgrades over time that you make into the system. And so if you looked at Indiana compared to the US in terms of rate growth and a cents per kilowatt hour growth, you can see again, Indiana's relative change is great from the 90s to early 2000s. increases faster than the national average 2002 to 2016. And you see that we're actually increasing again from 2017 to 2023 slower than the national average on our rate structure. And so to what Chairman Soliday pointed out earlier, the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab does a great study each year on cost causation and cost impacts at a state level throughout the country, trying to understand what's driving cost increases throughout the country, but also on a nominal basis and an adjusted for inflation basis. And so I've highlighted here, it's very small on the graphic on the right, but some of the drivers of increased prices that LBNL found when they looked at all the states over the past 5 years, what's driving price increases throughout the states. Well, you have investments in aging infrastructure, your transmission and distribution lines. You have natural gas prices are flowing into it. So the Russian invasion of Ukraine played a huge role. You have state renewable energy portfolio standards. So a state may say we want 30% of our generation from wind, 30% of our generation from solar. They're seeing that play a role in driving price increases in those states. Net energy metered solar is driving real price increases in states that have net metering still. You have recovery from extreme weather events. So states like Florida, California with wildfires are having to pay more to rebuild their systems. That's driving increased prices in those states. But what are drivers of lower costs in some states? Well, LBNL found customer load growth drove lower prices in states, again, because if you have system costs and you're spreading that over more kilowatt hours, you're able to lower your rates. And then they also found that market-based utility scale wind and solar energy resources have helped lower costs in states that have been able to bring those online as well, because again, those do not have a fuel cost associated with it, so you're lowering the costs associated there. So I wanted to break it into the distribution transmission a little bit because I think it's important to understand in the Midwest especially, you see a lot of utilities investing more in their distribution CapEx or the capital expenditures. And so again, that's shareholders contributing money to the system to build out the system. And ultimately, like I said earlier, you have to return that money to the investors through rates and charges. And so when you're making larger amounts of investments into your system, that has to come from somewhere. And so this is a graphic from Fulton County RMC and the Indiana Electric Cooperative showing just price changes in equipment on the distribution level from 2020 to 2024. And you can see here that the lowest cost increase is 37%. Over that 4-year period. But there are a lot of equipment components that have almost doubled in price over that 4-year period. So what happens when you have a new neighborhood come in and you have to build the wire, the pole, the transformers, et cetera, your utility is now paying double for that same infrastructure. A storm comes in and you have to replace the distribution system in that neighborhood. Your utility is now paying double for the same infrastructure that was there before. So how do you deal with that? You ultimately have to recover that through rates and charges. So again, this idea of this is from the IURC PBR report. There are fixed and variable costs of the system that need to be recovered through rates and charges. The more you're able to increase your kilowatt hours sold, the more you can spread those fixed costs over the system. And that's important because that's what House Enrolled Act 1007 was trying to do last year in terms of how do you handle that incremental load to the system and how do you benefit from that for existing ratepayers, pay down those fixed costs while ensuring they don't have to pay for the cost of that incremental load to the system. And so again, net generation previously has been to replace retiring units. We had a max peak. Our peak's gone down a little bit, instead steady. So we haven't had to build a lot of new generation recently. And there are factors to consider. So remember, data centers use a significant amount of electricity. So we all know this now. There are cost pressures elsewhere in the system, your distribution transmission system. Your data centers can be built quickly and come online quickly. And it's tough to sometimes to make sure that they come online at the same time, power generation. And then going back to cost of service rate, making a cost allocation, how do you allocate the cost of that new generation over time so it benefits the whole system in this new type of industrial customer? So remember, IURC is assuring that cost recovery for investments found just and reasonable. How do you have a least regrets approach to serving that new generation, keeping in mind that I do not know.
What going to ask LSA to do is email to each of you both of these presentations today and the link to the Livermore study so that they're available to everyone.
Right. Least regrettable approach, policy flows in the cost, flows in the rates. So how can you get data centers onto your system and help the fixed cost of the system to lower rates for other people? That was the genesis of House Rule Act 1007. You're balancing benefits and risks of that. You're adding new costs to the system, but how can you benefit by spreading those fixed costs over more kilowatt hours sold? And so ultimately, is it still there? Yeah. Okay. We back? Okay.
Like for me to explain Rule 15 to 20. If it is a high load user, they are going to buy the electricity that they said they wanted. And if they pull out, they pay 80% of the cost of construction of the new facility, and the facility is owned. The latest one, I see my good friend from India smirking, but it happens to be pretty darn good legislation. The latest contract signed for 2 data centers in Northwest Indiana, they are paying 100% of the cost of construction of the utility, of the electric generation. And as Luke just pointed out, we have at least one utility that will probably file for a rate reduction because the data centers are paying 40% of the fixed cost. So very simply said, if I have a generating facility and it costs me $10 to operate, and I have one customer, they pay $10. If I have 10 customers, they pay $1. So the more users we have, again, the equation's more complex than that, but we're finding now that we're getting some experience is we actually wind up spreading the fixed costs out over a wider base. So a lot of the rhetoric that we're hearing in the paper, by the way, the water use of both of those facilities, only 5% of the time will they be drawing new water. All the rest of it is recycled water due to new technology and so forth. So trying to, as technology emerges, it's whether it was, I remember when cell phones were going to cause your ears to weigh 1 pound, and that has not worked out, fortunately. So there's always hyperbole and there's always speculation on those folks, but we're starting to sort out. We've had data centers since, Senator Cook and I have a debate. He says since 1946, I say since 1951 or something like that. They're not new. It's just that there's a lot more of them right now. So we're getting more and more experience and more data and better understanding what their impact on the system is. But they are not going to suck all of the electricity out of the state of Indiana. We already have laws in place to protect that. We saw the increase in demand coming. It's called a duck bill. And we saw it coming. That's why we did 4 years of task force. So for a utility not to have generation capacity, there are consequences. And as I said before, we've looked at it fairly carefully. It takes about 3.5 years to build a large load user, be it a chip factory or whatever. It takes about the same time to build a gas-fired plant. Will nuclear someday be available? It may, but if you do a Gantt chart, takes about 3 years to build an SMR factory, then another 3 to 4 years to build the first. These are not Ford Explorers, so they may make 1 or 2 a year. And so if you do that, you look at our total load just today, nukes are not going to, no matter where you stand on the issue, they're not taking over in 5 years. We may have one in 5 to 7, but if you, God forbid, we'd ever do a Gantt chart with here's production capacity and so forth, it would take a long time for us to even have 50% of our load nuclear. So we have thought it through. We have legislation in place, and it's been a summer of extremism and trying to walk back outrageous statements is nearly impossible in the age of Facebook. So trying to act responsibly in a very measured way is, for a guy of 29 years old, look what it's done to me. So are we going to? No.
Oh, they were getting yet another cable off of Shaw.
I'm sorry, folks, but I mean, it's fairly important to the presentation because there are graphs and so forth that make fairly complex things more simple.
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah,
are we open for a couple questions while we're waiting?
sure.
Could you explain to me when you gave the examples of the ROE, that was the top line to rate the rate. So who sets that ROE?
The ROE is ultimately set by the IURC through the rate case process. And so essentially, the simplify, as I understand it, the utility comes in with sort of an expert witness that's saying, hey, here's what it will take for our investors to invest this money, or, comparing it to what other utilities did on their investments compared to what the current market is, recognizing that a utility investment is generally viewed as a safer investment. So the ROE is less than the market. So you have, they come in with their expert witness saying, here's what our peer utilities are using. Here's a range of ROE we're recommending. Then the Office of Utility Consumer Counselor will come in. Interveners will come in with their own expert witnesses that say, no, you don't need a 10% ROE, a 9% ROE is better. And this is our reasons why. And then the IURC's job as that sort of judge and jury is to read through the expert witness testimony on both sides and ultimately find what's the right balance there for the ROE. So ultimately, the IURC sets that return on equity equation based on the evidence in the cases before it, which is sort of based on what's it actually take to attract that capital investment into the system. Because I want my utilities to continue building their system. I don't want the investors to put that money into the S&P 500.
And I think it's important to note that what the IURC sets is a quasi cap. If they go over that, then there is an additional regulatory process to look at. We have no utility at or near their cap, to my knowledge.
Right, and because it gets complicated, because ultimately in rate making, you want to have usage be responsive to ultimately the bills, right? Because I want individuals to have greater control of their bills. And so if you use less electricity, I want you to be able to noticeably reduce your bills. Because ultimately the line I've heard is that, ultimately something about 75% of your costs are fixed costs within a utility system and 25% is variable. But how do I adjust for that in a rate structure? So generally speaking, you assign more fixed costs in the kilowatt hours. So that way you can noticeably know that if I go from 400 kilowatts in a month to 350 kilowatts in a month, I'm reducing my rate more, even though my fixed costs remain the same. And so what that happens is, and what that gives an incentive for utilities to do, is to sell more electricity in a certain degree because they can make more money. But if they over earn, if they earn above their weighted average cost of capital, the IURC does a periodic review every year on the utilities. And if they're over earning, the IURC can call them back in and essentially reset that. Okay, awesome. So going back to the policy, the cost of actions, how do you account for these new large incremental loads? You have two processes set up by HGA 1007, the large load customer CPCNs, the EGR plans, the expedited generation resource plans. Remembering that the IURC approves all new generation in the state through that CPCN process, certification of public convenience and necessity, and this process has a 240-day shot clock. So HGA 1007 created an expedited CPCN process that pairs up a specific customer with a specific generation project, and that customer must commit to paying for 80% of that project's cost, regardless of their in-service time. And so that's important because generally, again, going back earlier to that example depreciation schedule, you're returning that capital and the return on capital over time. And so generally you do that through your usage and demand charges. What the HGA 1007 said is if you are our customer for 1 year, 15 years, 30 years, if you're only here for 1 year, you're still paying for 80% of the cost of that generation. You have to provide the financial assurances for that. And so you're trying to minimize that long-term tail risk of a customer leaving before generation assets actually paid off completely. So as part of this, because there's that risk, the utility can request the large load customer themselves pay a risk premium for the project. They still have to demonstrate compliance with the 5 pillars, and the IURC ultimately determines if the proposal is just and reasonable in the public interest. The second pathway, the EGR plan, is a portfolio approach for these new customers. So I'm going from 5 gigawatts of load to 10 gigawatts of load. How do I serve that whole new customer base with a new generation portfolio? And you think about this as like a mini IRP. So now I know I'm doing a new chunk of load. How am I going to serve that? Going back to the IRP model of lowest delivered cost while maintaining flexibility, optionality. And so ultimately, you go through this mini IRP process to figure out, maybe you put out a RFP for generation resources, figure out what's available to be built or sold. And then you come back to the IURC for approval of that plan to meet that new generation resource. It's almost like a pre-approved mortgage. So now I can go out to a company and say, hey, my commission's already said this plan is generally good. I need 2 gigawatts of natural gas. I need 800 megawatts of wind. I need 500 megawatts of solar. I've already know that I need this type of resource. What can we do on price? And the idea here is to be a quicker speed the market on those negotiations and that transaction. So then once you find that resource, the utility negotiates with that developer or that other company and says, hey, here's the price. I come back to the IURC with the details of that. And then it's up to the IURC and the interveners to say, is that price reasonable? Is that just and reasonable? And then the utility needs to show how ratepayers are protected through their existing tariff structure, et cetera, like Indiana Michigan Power did. Because ultimately, we've seen 2 utilities so far in the state take 2 different paths. Indiana Michigan Power is going down the EGR pathway, and NIPSCO is going down the large load customer CPCN process, which I want to talk about a little bit more. And so I apologize for the complexity of this graph, but I think it's important to highlight the benefits of how policy goes and cost goes in the rates. So the retail utility, that left side, that's your normal process. You have your retail utility serving existing industrial, residential, commercial customers on the left. And then the bottom right, you see that new large load customer comes onto the system. That retail utility needs to serve that new large load customer, but you need a new power plant to serve that, and that new power plant's on the right. So how do you accomplish that? Well, with this large load CPCN process and the NIPSCO GenCo model, what NIPSCO has done is essentially create a subsidiary, a generating utility in that top right corner that's going to build and own a new power plant to serve that new large load customer. That large load customer is still a customer of the retail utility NIPSCO, but will have a special contract for service for what its payments are. NIPSCO will then have a PPA, a power purchase agreement with the generating utility to buy the power from the generating utility from that new power plant that will ultimately be used to serve that large load customer. And the important aspect here is that dollar sign, follow the money. So the new large load customer is paying through that special contract for service to the retail utility. That retail utility is purchasing that power from the GenCo. and that Genco is ultimately using that money to pay for the new power plant. And that's important because what did we just see? NIPSCO announced that $7 billion agreement with Amazon for service, where Amazon committed to paying for 100% of its transmission and generation costs associated with its new data center. That new power plant, which is a 2.6 gigawatt natural gas facility, 400 megawatts of battery, is going to be owned by Genco. But Amazon also agreed to pay for, over its 15-year contract, $1 billion of fixed cost on NIPSCO's system. Where does that benefit customers? That's paying for their share of the fixed cost system. So what NIPSCO has proposed, and it's currently pending IURC docket, is that it's going to flow back that $1 billion in fixed cost every month as a monthly bill credit to customers. And that'll be small at first. It'll be in the, I guess it'll be in the nickels now. And then over time, as Amazon is getting more and more power from it, from NIPSCO through the generating utility, that credit will eventually grow to $1, $2, $3, $4 per month on the credit, showing how the data center is paying for the fixed cost of the system. And I highlight that because I want to highlight how policy can drive cost, can drive rates. And so this is a policy, while it's trying to separate or bifurcate those costs into a different way, and it's helping reduce rates. And I say that because this is the lead in to the performance-based rate making presentation you're about to hear from Dr. Borum, that a common criticism of cost of regulation is called the average Johnson effect. So Representative Westrow, to your earlier question, ultimately speaking, a utility earns a return on its capital investment, but that provides an incentive for a utility to continue investing in its system and possibly over-investing in its system or gold play in its system. Because ultimately, I think about it like a mortgage. Your first year of a mortgage, you're mainly paying interest, very little on the principal. Same thing with returning of and on capital investments. You have a lot of rate base. You haven't accumulated a lot of depreciation on that rate base. So that first year, there's a lot of return flowing back to the investor, not a lot of depreciation on that asset from the actual rate base itself. And so one way to try to invert this incentive to overinvest into a system is to engage in performance-based rate making, where policymakers are trying to give utilities other system incentives to pursue, for example, based on reliability incentives you may set or affordability metrics you may set. And so with that, happy to take any questions. And if not, I'll hand it over to Brad to talk more in depth about what performance-based rate making is.
Thank you so much. Again, we're going to, Sarah, you were out, so I just gave you a bunch of stuff to do. That's why you always we would like you to send copies of this presentation, the PBR one, emailed to each one of the committee, including those that aren't here today. And I don't know, do you have access to the Brattle Livermore report itself?
I don't, but I can find it.
We'll try to have that sent to you also, just to make it easy for you. You don't have to look it up, okay? Thank you, thank you.
Good morning. My name is, thank you for inviting me over, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, committee members. Much of my material has already been covered in some way or another, so we will probably skip a number of slides here. Let me put on my glasses so I can actually see what I'm doing here.
You know, having been raised in a tradition where the pastor makes the same 3 points at least 3 times, feel free to review anything that we've already heard. So,
well, as has already was covered earlier, I mean, the IURC was tasked in 2023 by the General Assembly to do a PBR study with recommendations as to the appropriate design framework and requirements for effective implementation of PBR mechanisms thought to be appropriate for Indiana. And there will be a little bit more conversation about that in a bit. As part of this process, the commission issued an RFP seeking outside expertise to put together a study for us on PBR and how where it's been used and its different characteristics across different jurisdictions. Out of that process, we hired Christensen and Associates Energy Consulting, or is referred to in the report and stuff, CA Energy Consulting. They are a nationally recognized expert on the topic of performance-based regulation with experience in multiple states, Canada, and if my memory serves me right, even Europe. So they are definitely a well-known outfit in this area. In terms of the PBR status, this was discussed at a earlier speaker, but here kind of like the visual, and you can see where states are that are doing looking at this or implementing different forms of PBR, and those states that have decided to put them on hold for the time being. One thing I will note here, and there'll be more about this later, is there are no pure forms of PBR. It usually winds up being a mix of different combinations of aspects of different types of PBR. And it really does depend on a great deal about what your industry structure and your traditional regulatory structure is that drives a lot of your considerations.
Let me just point out one thing, since I've been critiqued going down this path, that this is a Democrat only. Florida, the last I checked, was not a Democratic state. So this is not, just to beat this to death, this is not a partisan issue. It may be when we vote the bill, but it is not only. Oklahoma is not exactly a Democratic state. So many states are looking at it. We're looking at it as a better means of accountability. But for those folks who call me and say this is only a Democratic idea, it is not a Democratic idea. It is an idea.
Much of this has been covered already, but it's why consider PBR? I mean, each utility has an exclusive service territory in Indiana, which means they are a monopoly provider with an obligation to serve at reasonable rates and good levels of reliability. And again, Luke touched on this, but that each utility is provided an opportunity to recover the cost of providing electric service and earn a reasonable return on and of the capital invested. Again, that is an opportunity. It is not a guarantee. Now, for numerous reasons, traditional rate-based regulation is perceived as being cost plus in nature and is thought to reduce incentives that utility management has to make investment and operating decisions. So as we've just discussed, numerous states have tried to come up with different forms of regulation or modifications to the regulatory process to encourage higher levels of efficiency and better decision-making by utility management. And the problem here is, of course, the utility always has more information and more timely information than a utility commission. So therefore, it's hard for us to know, is the utility always making good decisions? We don't have that level of information, and we can't have that level of information. So what you want to do is try to create a structure that encourages utility management to make as good of use of the information it has available in its operations and its capital investments as possible. Now, there are, I keep forgetting here to do this. Categories of PBR tools. CA Energy Consulting did a nice job, I think, of kind of putting the different types of PBR plans in two large buckets. One, as we've heard many times today, is the multi-year rate plans. And the other is performance incentive mechanisms, or PIMs. So those are the two big buckets. But you'll see here the multi-year rate plans have two different general flavors. And in each of them, you're trying to set up a process about how rates or the revenues will be adjusted over a period of time. This is often 3 to a 5 year period to give the utility incentives to, as much incentives as possible to improve efficiencies, while at the end of that period, then you have a traditional rate case to reset rates and begin the process anew. But under multi-year rate plans, the one big flavor is indexed caps on prices or revenues. They're different. But in this case, you allow revenues or or prices to change with an inflation rate component adjusted for a productivity component. And these are two things that are not subject to the utilities control. You have to decide what inflation rate you're going to use, and you have to decide what productivity index you're going to use. But those are national or metrics that the utility itself has no control over. It sets revenues that way over the multi-year period, and that is what gives the utility the incentive to perform well, because in the interim, the only thing it can do is control its cost. It can't adjust its revenues. It's out of its hands. It's set by this formula. Now, I will emphasize here that applying index rates to vertically integrated utilities is not usually done. It's usually much more focused on distribution-only utilities, or just the distribution side of the utility business. You're talking about a vertically integrated utility. Just because a vertically integrated utility brings in lots of complications. The other form of multi-year rate plan is what's called a forecasted multi-year rate plan, which relies on the utility's own forecast of its revenue requirement over a 3 to 5 year period. So in this process, the utility would forecast its revenue requirement. We've had some conversation about what that is, and they would do it projected over a 3 or 5 year period. And that would be approved by the commission through a formal hearing process. And then that would be set for that time period. And again, with the revenue set, then the utility has its incentives to try to keep costs under control, with the thought that it can keep whatever it can save during that period of time. Now, again, as we said, this would include as part of a forecasted approach. You'd have to include estimates of future operating expenses, capital investments, depreciation, taxes, and the allowed rate of return. So it's kind of like you're setting a rate case for each one of those individual years, saying what you think the revenue requirement should be. The other major category of performance-based regulation is what we've been referring to as performance incentive mechanisms, or PIMs. And these are more easily thought of as with multi-year rate plans, you're fundamentally changing how you're setting rates. Here, you can keep the traditional rate setting process, but then you're putting on in specific performance metrics that then get financial rewards or penalties if they're met. It could be distribution outage performance is one target. And it could be taking a look at how they call center performance, what they're doing with their non-fuel O&M expenses. Those are different areas that you can monitor, set targets for, and then, depending on how well they do, reward them or penalize them. Very complicated process, but that's something that can be put on top of the existing regulatory process, or it's perceived to be that way. And this is facilitated by the fact that the commission collects annual performance metrics reports from each of the 5 investor-owned utilities that cover affordability, generation unit performance, distribution outages, customer service, affordability. There's employee safety. So we already collect a great deal of data in this area that would be part of anything where you go down developing PIMs. Now, I need to emphasize, collecting this data is different than a PIM. A PIM means you're setting a target performance in each of these areas, and then you're tying financial rewards and penalties to that. And that's hard to work out, because you don't want to reward them too much, but you don't want to penalize them too much either. So it's a complicated process, but it is facilitated by the fact that the commission collects lots of this data already. It's just a matter of how would we use it going forward. Now, CA Energy Consulting also emphasized in their report, and this is what I mentioned briefly a little bit ago, there's a number of things you have to keep in mind when you're evaluating what kind of PBR you might want to implement. And One of them is the industry structure. As we've talked about earlier, whether a utility is vertically integrated across generation, transmission, or distribution is critical. Most index multi-year rate plans do not apply to vertically integrated utilities. They're distribution only. Generation and transmission create lots of difficulties for them. And then more easily handled under a forecasted multi-year rate plan. But also another feature is regional transmission organizations. Utilities investment in transmission and a lot of its transmission operations aren't totally within its control, or the costs that flow through to it is coming through the RTO, not solely its own decisions or management's decisions as to how to operate the utility. You get into the generation mix. A lot of that gets down to not only the type generation mix, but where are you in your investment cycle? How much of your generation plants are being turned over? And then in general, you have the problem of large capital investments with very long lives. In different forms of invest in PBRs have difficulty dealing with that. And hence they often wind up focusing on different aspects of O&M expenses or reliability performance on the distribution system or call center performance. Now, and I won't go into too much here, but another, because this has largely been covered by Luke earlier. But another key consideration is Indiana's regulatory process. What processes already are in place in Indiana? Of course, we have traditional rate-based regulation, and you can see the formula right there. But we also have forward test year revenue requirements that utilities can make use of and are making use of, where utility can use a projected future test year to set its rates out 2 years from when they file their petition. And that, as CA Energy Consulting noted, that's similar to what would be done with a forecasted multi-year rate plan, except in here we just do it 1 year test year. There you'd be doing 3 years or 5 years. So it's much more complicated when you're going that far out. But also Indiana has a lot of trackers. That actually reduces regulatory lag. Regulatory lag is good in our parlance because you set rates based on one set of observation of cost, and then they're locked in for a while until you have another rate case or change them. During that time, the utility has an incentive to save or perform efficiently, save costs, reduce costs when it can. The problem with lots of trackers is you reduce regulatory lag. So regulatory lag from our perspective is a good thing. Trackers reduce it. That doesn't mean trackers are good or bad. It's just an implication of trackers that needs to be understood and kept in mind. Of course, Indiana has the 5 pillars. And then, as I talked about briefly a moment ago, we already collect extensive performance metrics for the 5 investor-owned utilities: SAFE, SAIDI, CAIDI, safety of employees, vegetation management, generation, customer experience, operations metrics, affordability, and staffing. Obviously, a big issue there has been the level of retirements as utilities lose lots of experienced employees through retirement, and then trying to bring in new employees to replace them. Now, these are high level advantages or challenges of multi-year rate plans, and they're grouped here together, although they are a little bit different depending upon whether you're talking about an indexed rate formula or a multi-year rate plan or a forecasted multi-year rate plan. But generally, one advantage is everyone better understands what the revenue requirement is going to be over a specific period of time of 3 to 5 years. That hopefully improves rate stability for customers. As I've said, longer time between rate applications increases the incentive to find cost efficiencies. Now, as we know, that varies because, as Chairman Soliday noted earlier, we've had utilities stay out for 20 years. And then we've had utilities recently coming in every 2 years. How much that is, the time between rate cases, it's dependent upon where you are in the investment cycle and other things going on. And then again, conceivably, there can be a reduced regulatory burden, although that is most states that have gone down the PBR path, it takes a lot of effort by commission staff, the utilities, and other stakeholders to put these things into place. Because once you put them in place, they're expensive, they're difficult to stand up, and then you have to be constantly modifying them as you learn and gain experience with them. So it's an ongoing process. It doesn't mean you don't do it, but don't buy into the fact that it's easy and can save lots of time and effort up front in terms of staff and utility and stakeholder resources. It can over time, but it takes a while. And then the problems are, of course, the status quo. People are comfortable with what we have now and know. Making changes, especially large ones, everyone kind of says, I'm not sure if I want to go down this path. And then the data requirements, especially when you're looking at the forecasted revenue multi-year rate plan, can be pretty, onerous trying to put together a projection of cost for 3 to 5 year period. And then monitoring how well those cost projections are actually, how well those are actually hold up. So then the next thing here is going to the PIMs, or performance incentive mechanisms. This is something where you can probably align these to a considerable extent with the 5 pillars that you have the Indiana General Assembly has created. So you can prioritize policy goals. And again, that's something that should come from the General Assembly in general if you want to go down this path. So you shift the focus to measurable outcomes in certain areas. And this is something where it can be added to the existing regulatory framework. And a big focus here is, while you're trying to improve the utilities incentives to reduce cost or operate efficiently, you also want to monitor utility performance in terms of how its quality of service holds up, in terms of, again, distribution system outages performance and call center operations. Those are big areas that you want to keep track of, because history has shown those are areas where they like to cut cost if they can. Then there's you get a lot more flexibility and transparency into what is going on in the utility services, different aspects of their operations. But the problem that you have is design complexity. All right, there's challenges regarding the quantification of the performance outcomes, and then the reward and penalty levels that I referenced earlier. And you also have to try to figure out, how do you account for external factors that impact performance that's totally out of the utility's control. Those things will happen. And you will have to have a process where you make modifications to account for that. And then there's always, the law of unintended consequences. You incent performance in certain areas. Of course, then that encourages the utility to move resources to that area and take it away from other areas. So you need to be monitoring other aspects of company operations and performance to really monitor what's going on. Now, as part of this process, CA Energy Consulting did a pretty extensive stakeholder process with the utilities, the Citizens Action Coalition, the industrial groups, the Utility Consumer Counselor's Office, and there were other groups involved. And they did that with 2 surveys or questionnaires that they asked the stakeholders to fill out about what their perceptions were of PBR and its different aspects. And then, so they did that first, issued one, then they had a virtual meeting where CA Energy walked through some of these concepts with the stakeholders, and then later sent a second questionnaire out to see how people's, or the different stakeholders' perceptions or thoughts had changed following that stakeholder meeting. And you can see the general comments here were there were differing views on willingness to overhaul Indiana's current regulatory framework, but almost all of them said they were open to incremental changes, especially if they were optional. They all pretty much across the board said the devil's in the details. Something may sound good conceptually, but I need to see the details to really see how comfortable I am with that. And again, that was across the board. In another area that the stakeholders clearly understood is it's hard to define what is success under PBR. What is success? And the problem there, of course, is you have no idea what the utility's performance would have been, but for the existence of the program. So how do you compare it? Well, what are you comparing it to? So that is a but-for problem. And then because the utility industry is very capital intensive, as we've talked about earlier, 75% of the costs are fixed. It's very capital intensive with long-lived capital investments. So performance can only change over time as you adjust your investment policies over time. So it is a complicated process. Once you go down this path, you need to stick with it if you really want to see if it's going to work and pay dividends down the road. It's not something you can set up and say, oops, after a couple of years, I don't like it, let's get out. Once you go down this path, you're kind of stuck with it for a while, I think, if you really want to give it a fair shot. And then my final thought on this is not surprising. PBR is another tool in the regulatory toolbox. Implementation through an incremental and deliberative process will help minimize unintended consequences while helping achieve public policy goals. And the big thing is clarity as to what the public policy goals are. And then you do really need to have wide participation by the various stakeholders, because everybody brings helpful perspectives in these discussions. So it is a process, and it will be ongoing depending upon what exactly you do or want to do in the state of Indiana. Can it be done? Yes. Can it be done well? It has rarely been done well, but it can be done. And I think it can make marginal improvements, but again, it takes time to get there. And with that, I'm open for questions.
Questions? Seeing none, just one part of your presentation tickled me, because having been a fairly active safety professional in the past, I remember the argument when we would put in an intervention for 10 to the minus 6 probability of occurrence. The argument was, well, if you hadn't done anything, look, this year, nothing happened. So, gee whiz, we shouldn't have even done any safety intervention. Yep. So that's sort of an argument that I have been through multiple times. So yep. The other piece that I think that is, as we're approaching it, as we have done with other things, we've tried to be very measured. I think you'll admit that we already have pieces of PBR at the IURC imposed on utilities currently. So some of the things we are proposing, hopefully will come out in the bill, are not really PBR. They are trying to make things more clear, easier on folks of limited means. And other things are, while they are under PBR, are trying to signal stability, much so that we were not, with so much going on, so much change going on, an aging infrastructure. There is some hope with some of the things we're doing. I've listened to at least one entity present for 20 years, even when we were number 4 cheapest electricity, complain about trackers and how terrible they are. Now, when we're going to, in a system, probably reduce the number of trackers, that's going to be bad. I predict what the testimony will be. But again, we're trying to address concerns that were raised. I hope out of what we've seen today, this is a hugely complex process for good reason. And there's some advocacy out there for deregulation. The most expensive electricity in America is in deregulated states. And I can give you the political reasons for it. Is only about twice as bad as elected utility regulatory commissions, which are also the most expensive in the United States. So just to save everybody a lot of time, we're not going to hear a deregulation bill this year. So hire the hallway. It's not going to happen. So with that, thank you. I don't see any. You have a question, Matt?
Actually, I just wanted to make a quick statement whenever that's appropriate.
Sure.
Yeah, so I've really forced myself to be in listening mode today, despite many urges to raise nuances that are lurking out there. So I just wanted to make a few quick comments that really across all of today's presentations. On the performance-based rate making, I just say it kind of reminds me of the school funding formula a little bit, where you kind of can discuss and talk about all different elements, but at the end of the day, you just want the school run, which tells you whether your school is getting more money or less money. So I kind of feel like at the end of the day, I'd just like to know, is this going to be less expensive rates or more expensive rates? And I suspect that maybe you can't do that with this process.
Let me address that, because in the PIM that we're considering, there will be a clear measure of whether the rates, the bill that comes to the consumer is going up or going down. And I'm with you. This is a big day, Representative Pierce. We need to have clear, measurable, that the citizen, if they put a little effort in, can tell whether their bill is going up or down, and whether that is driven by their usage or whether that is driven by policy or cost. So that is the hope in what we're doing with the PIM related to cost. We may or may not succeed, but I think the environment we're in, doing nothing is not an option. Okay.
Okay, and then I just kind of on some of the earlier presentations that we had in this attempt to try to make rates more affordable. It sounds like some of the incremental things that are going to be proposed will probably be helpful, and so that's good. But we could be a little bit more aggressive and do some things that some other states have done. For example, some states just create a rate class of lower income people, and they get those rates. So they're fit some metric from affordability, and then there's, obviously that means there's going to be some rate shifting there, but I've been told it's not significant. But anyway, that's something worth looking at. Now, on the Courts and Criminal Code Committee, Representative Sturwald is always complaining to me that I always want more. So then maybe that's my nature.
Is that not your role?
Yeah, that might be that's one thing. And then just on the rates, the generation side is interesting. And first of all, I'd like to say this could be like a full day, maybe 2-day symposium, and you could really bore down in the nuances, which would be awesome, but we don't really have that time, or probably the patience of the members. But the generation piece is really interesting to me, because generally when you talk about the perverse incentives in the current rate making system, if you can get a really expensive power plant into your rate base, that's going to give you, that return on equity on top of that. That's really going to help your shareholders out. So there's kind of an incentive to want to do that. And then we have this kind of external thing with the data centers coming online, and whether that's good or bad, and how that impacts rates, and whether they're paying for the whole thing. I wanted to make a point that in the presentation, they talked about the 2 paths in 1007 to get to this expedited generation approval. And you've got the one where you say it's a data center that's causing this increase. So you have that process. And there we're making sure the consumer is not going to pay more than 20% of the cost of that new generation. But if they take the other path and just say, generally, my demand is going to go up, that limit is not there. And we fixed that in the House, and then the Senate unfixed it. And so I'm just wondering whether we might have a loophole where you could have data centers creating more demand, but you the utility chooses just to use the pathway where they say, well, overall, my demand's going up. And then the consumers would lose the protections that are in the bill as far as how much they're going to pay on new generation for data centers. So I think that's just still an issue out there that the House attempted to address and the Senate decided not to. So I don't know if we need to revisit that based on what we might be seeing coming into the commission. And just on coal, I appreciate the chairman pointing out it's not all environmental regulations, and sometimes it grates on me a little bit when people kind of suggest that some bureaucrats in DC are raising our rates because of these pesky environmental regulations. Those environmental regulations, beyond the market thing impacting coal, those environmental regulations are basically just taking what the economists would call the negative external costs of coal that coal didn't have to pay. So whether that's how many people have asthma and have to go to the doctor and get the inhaler, how much acid rain takes the paint off your car, whatever it is, coal was not having to pay those external costs that it was throwing off. And so what the regulations are really just doing is recognizing those external costs and bringing them back to where they're generated. And that's created difficulties for coal to be competitive in the marketplace, along with what the chairman pointed out, which is natural gas now being so plentiful and much lower for the most part. So when we get into old debate about, some people want to say the whole reason our rates are high is just we picked on coal and the bureaucrats made really bad policies, and that ruined the cool thing we had going. But I think the truth is it wasn't as cool as you thought if you went back and looked at it. So and then I guess just one final thought, which I think would be interesting, is, IOUs, we have to make sure they get a return on equity so their shareholders are rewarded, so they'll actually invest in the system and in the business. And we have this whole long, complex process to figure out how to balance all that out. It would be interesting to me to kind of see what these rates, it looks like when you don't have to do return on equity. So we have Indiana Electric Cooperatives, right? And they're nonprofits. They're just trying to provide the service. Now, they're often more expensive because they're serving a rural area where they have a lot fewer customers and they're spread over really long distances. So it's hard to do a comparison. But we do have municipal power companies that serve their communities, which maybe is more concentrated, more closer analog to investor-owned utility. But if you wanted to really get kind of, I was going to say radical, but that's not the word I want, you could get much more significant in your policy proposals, looking at like, what if you just had municipal power-based nonprofit provision of service throughout the state? Would it be better or not? Now, I know some will say, well, look at Puerto Rico, they didn't invest in their system and it was a big disaster, and that's why that doesn't work. But that would be an interesting discussion or investigation to have.
Any other comments, questions? Thank you all for coming this morning. We thought if we could get some background ahead of time, we'll try to probably, to your point, Representative Pierce, we've both been at this for a long, long time. And it's, if you only knew what you knew yesterday, you're behind. And so it's what makes it fun and challenging. But there are some basic things we need to understand, and the PBR report to the IURC is from the IURC is online on the IURC website. It's long. I would encourage you. I've read it. The executive summary does not do justice to the report, so I would suggest if it's a cold evening with the fireplace, you read the whole report, because it does do a lot of more justice to the nuances. What we are proposing, I think we're proposing, as the report said, there are no two alike. North Carolina, we've looked at pretty carefully. We've looked at Hawaii. Hawaii is hugely complex. I just, with the 3-seat change in the IURC, I just don't think that would be wise to go down that path. So, and we may or may not be able to pass something this year, but what we've tried to do is make something that addresses the poor, and at the same time addresses transparency and makes an incremental, not revolutionary change. So that's the intent. We'll have plenty of time for discussion. I'm not planning on hearing a lot of bills this year. This will be and if we have to take 2 hearings to hear this, we will do that. So with that, unless I see further comments or questions, we're adjourned.